Although now I am unmuted, so we can now talk. Thank you, and thank you all for coming, because it's very, very nice and appreciated that you've chosen to show up and participate in this discussion. We're discussing this evening the topic of incurring risks or risking one's life to save the life of another, and according to Jewish law and tradition. So this is a very tricky and difficult topic, an ethical dilemma, and it comes up in various forms. In this particular year, we've seen, unfortunately, a lot of it with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I was looking on the internet, and the latest numbers I found was from April the 15th, about a month and a half ago, which feels like a lifetime ago, unfortunately, the way things have been going the last several weeks. But on April 15th, the news reported that across the country, nearly 9,300 U.S. healthcare workers had contracted COVID. They themselves came down with COVID, and it was thought that, generally speaking, that was in the course of their work. 27 had died. That's at that time, which is almost a month and a half ago, and you can be sure the numbers are much greater now. And that does lead to a question as to the issue, the ethical, moral matter, and we'll discuss it from the Jewish standpoint, of incurring a risk to one's life to save the life of somebody else. Now, it's not just healthcare workers. There's been volunteers, volunteer people who assisted in health, and people with COVID patients who have come down ill themselves. There's actually a massive Jewish volunteer organization, primarily in the Metro New York area, Hatzalah. I was just told today by an old friend of mine, Rabbi Aaron Kagan, who used to be my partner here at the Kollel. I should introduce myself, by the way. I don't think I introduced myself. My name is Rabbi Levi Langer, and I am the dean of the Kollel, and I used to have a partner here, Rabbi Kagan, who tells me he's now on the board of Hatzalah in New York. He told me that Hatzalah of Flatbush alone, which is one section of Brooklyn, over a 4-week period, responded to 6,500 COVID cases. That's in a 1 4-week period, and quite a few of them actually got sickened on their own. A few died, and they had to adopt various precautions and cut back somewhat, because they didn't want to endanger themselves. But this is a real issue. And we want to discuss basically a number of possibilities. First of all, is it mandated Jewishly to risk your life? Is it a ritual obligation, Jewishly speaking, to risk your life to somebody else? Maybe it's not obligated, but it's something which is laudable and a good thing, or maybe it's a bad thing, and maybe it depends on the level of risk. Maybe it depends whether it's a small risk or a very big risk. How do we understand that, Jewishly speaking? And the truth of the matter is, I mean, this has been an ethical question for forever, and a lot of times it comes up in the context of a burning building. Not that people usually have a lot of time to think, but the building is burning, heaven forbid, and there are people trapped inside the building, and you want to dive in and save them, but you're risking your own life. Is that good, bad, indifferent? Is it the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do? The same thing as somebody, heaven forbid, is drowning in the river, and you want to jump in and try to save them. And this kind of thing comes up. And one last example, which we're going to talk about, historically, over the last 50 years, has been a discussion among the rabbinic authorities, is the question of organ donation, live organ donation, particularly kidney donations. And right here in Pittsburgh, we had the late Dr. Tom Starzl, a real wonderful man, a gem of a man, who was a real pioneer in this field. I co-led once a program on the subject of medical ethics together with Dr. Starzl, and I was very, very impressed with him. We hit it off really well. He gave me a copy of his book, a signed copy of his book, The Puzzled People. That's the name of Dr. Starzl's book. He discusses, and what I found very interesting about the book is that Dr. Starzl was very cognizant of the ethics. And it's a very big issue. In the early years of organ transplants, many of the patients died, of course, but also there was a certain amount of risk to the donor, which is greater than the risk today. It started in the 60s. You're talking about over 50 years ago. And at that time, the risk for the donor was some sort, you can donate a kidney and you can live with one kidney, but there was some sort of risk there. Today, the risk is considered to be much lower and a very small risk to donate a kidney. So does that mean, Jewishly speaking, that you're obligated, if you know that you're a donor, you can be a donor, are you obligated to donate a kidney? Is it the right thing to do, but not obligatory? So these are all questions. And that particular question with the organ donation, the kidney donation, was discussed extensively among the religious authorities at that time, 60 or 50 years ago. So we'll get into a discussion of that. Okay, so let's begin with a couple of source texts from the Talmud. Very, very often, as we mentioned, the halachic, the poskim, the writers of halacha will try to find ancient texts that support modern questions. Now, you have to know how to extrapolate and to apply it. It can be very tricky and difficult to apply the ancient text to the modern day issues. Not a simple matter, but they'll generally try to begin with the Talmud. And we have a passage in the Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, which reads as follows. This is a bit of a story, and it says in the Jerusalem Talmud that Rabbi Ami, the name of one of the sages in Jerusalem, Rabbi Ami was taken captive by kidnappers. So his life was in danger, clearly in danger, and the kidnappers were known to be brutal people, and it was very, very clear that his life was very likely to be forfeit. And the sages, the rabbis in the Bet Midrash, in the study hall, very nervous about the fate of Rabbi Ami. So one of them, Rabbi Yonatan, said, let's prepare the shroud. Nothing we can do about it. We're a bunch of scholars. What can we do against these bandits, these hoodlums that have taken him captive? There's nothing we can do. Let's just prepare the shrouds. He's going to die. So another scholar, Reish Lakish, said otherwise. Now, Reish Lakish, according to the Talmudic tradition, was actually, he had an early life as a bandit himself, as a hoodlum himself. The Gemara tells us about the story of Reish Lakish. He started as a hoodlum, as a bandit. Afterwards, he changed his life completely, turned around and became a scholar. But he, as you see from a couple of stories in the Talmud, Reish Lakish remained an intrepid soul to the end, a courageous, muscular individual. And Reish Lakish said, nothing doing. I'm not going to take this lying down. I'm going after Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ami, I'm going to go after those kidnappers. Either I will kill them or I will be killed. That's the story. We don't have the end of the story, so we don't know. But that's the story. Is either I'm going to kill them or I'm going to be killed. And there is an indication here, and some early authorities, early medieval authorities, Agos Maimonides, written around the year 1300, and he and others understand this to be a determinative source. They say that you see here that you must risk, they consider it an obligation. You must risk your life, Jewishly speaking, to save the life of someone who is about to die. They're certainly going to die. You are just a risk. So therefore, you must incur that risk in order to save the life of someone who's going to die. You have someone who's drowning and they're in the river and it's raging the current and they can't swim. So you have to jump in because you know how to swim. You may drown yourself. It's a rapids and it's raging. Nonetheless, according to this opinion, you're actually obligated to jump in because of the fact that it's just a risk and somebody is about to die. You have to take on that risk. This is one way to look at it. It's based on the Jerusalem Talmud. Now, many other authorities think that there is a opposite contradictory source in the Babylonian Talmud. So we got to take it a second here. I just want to discuss it for a second. The two Talmuds. Now we have two Talmuds that have come down to us from ancient times. The Jerusalem Talmud was written by the sages, particularly in Jerusalem and ancient Israel. It was the final editing of the Jerusalem Talmud took place in the year approximately the middle of 4th century of the Common Era. The expression final editing is just a euphemism. Unfortunately, there never was really much editing because, and this is an important historical fact that's relevant for us, that the Jews in Israel at that time suffered enormously at the hands of the Byzantine Empire, which was a vestige of the Roman Empire. At that time, we deal with very, very brutal individuals, and they made many anti-religious decrees. And because of that, the Jerusalem Talmud is very, very hard to read. Even if you know Aramaic. If you don't know Aramaic, it's hopeless. But even if you know it, it just comes across, it's terse. There are thoughts that don't end. There are ideas that don't seem to conclude, and it goes on to the next section or segment. And this is ascribed to the fact that because of the persecutions and the terrible difficulties that they were going through, the Jews were not able to edit it, to do a final process of editing on the Jerusalem Talmud. That's important. We'll get back to that in a second. The Babylonian Talmud, which is the Talmud that's commonly studied today, was written in Babylon over the course of approximately 3 centuries, from the year 200 of the Common Era to the year 480. That's generally assumed that that was the final conclusion of the Babylonian Talmud, was the year 480. Even after that, by the way, there was an editorial process that took about a century and a half under the scholars, the post-Talmudic scholars, they're known as the Savoruim. Historically, that's what they're called. So the Babylonian Talmud went through, they had a lot more tranquility. They were able to study in peace pretty much, and their conclusions, their arguments reached conclusions. The sections of the Talmud have endings, and they come to some sort of a conclusion, generally speaking. The thoughts are clear. There's a clear methodological discussion, and it's been edited also. After the closing of the Talmud, there were editorial passages that were added, and that's a much clearer read of the Babylonian Talmud. Generally speaking, according to halachic tradition, when we have a discrepancy between the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, we follow the Babylonian Talmud, the Bavli. And that's for two reasons. First of all, because the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, is properly edited, and we know what the conclusions are. Whereas the Jerusalem Talmud was never properly edited, and you can never be sure. Maybe there was supposed to be another line or two at the end. You can't really be certain whether the passage has reached the conclusion or not. And that's one problem. The other issue is simply the fact that the Babylonian Talmud was concluded a century and a half later. Jerusalem Talmud is the mid-4th century. Babylonian Talmud is the end of the 5th century, in the year 480. And it's generally assumed that the basic arguments recorded by the Jerusalem sages made their way to Babylon over the course of time. So it's assumed that the Babylonian sages were familiar with what their predecessors had expressed and what they said. And if they said otherwise, we assume they took it into account, they thought it over, and they reached an opposite conclusion. We therefore go with the Babylonian Talmud because it's clear as a final editing, and because it's later, so we assume that they took into account the earlier arguments. Now, in the Babylonian Talmud, we have a story as follows. And the Gemara says it like this, that some fellows showed up at Rabbi Tarfon's door one day, very prominent sage of the Talmud. Rabbi Tarfon, they show up at his door and they're running and they're out of breath and they say, the government is after us. Somebody conjured up a whole false baloney story about us, and they said that we did some capital crime. You got to hide us. You have to save us. It's all not true. We never did anything, and lives are going to be forfeit if you don't hide us. So Rabbi Tarfon said to them, what can I do? It may be that you're telling the truth and you didn't do a thing, and maybe the government will determine that, in which case we'll be okay. But it may be you're lying, or it may be that you did do some sort of capital crime. It could be that I am endangering my own life in order to help you, and I can't help you there. I cannot risk my own life in order to help you. So therefore, he did not assist these fellows who said that their government was after them and that their lives are going to be forfeit. So this is what it says in the Babylonian Talmud, and many later authorities quote this passage in the Babylonian Talmud as determinative, which is to say that one does not risk one's life in order to save somebody else. Even if the life is going to be forfeit, you don't risk your life. Now, this is the two basic passages. Some consider the Jerusalem passage determinative. Resh Lakish said, I'm going to go out and I'll risk myself, I'll kill or I'll be killed. Others say, and this is the more decisive viewpoint, that the Babylonian Talmud is determinative and you don't risk your life. But there's many questions that still leaves intact, and there's questions about the degree of risk. The question is, is it meritorious to risk one's life? And so this question has come up in the context of a number of issues. So we'll discuss a couple of instances that occurred. Now, I just want to mention we had actually you're familiar, many of you I'm sure are familiar, we had a rabbi here at the Kollel. We have a rabbi at the Kollel that there was a terrible incident last year involving his brother in Norfolk, Virginia. This is a rabbi, a teacher in Norfolk, Virginia, took the kids out on an outing near the Atlantic shore. And the kids were just on the beach. They were wandering around, 9, 10-year-old kids. And the rabbi noticed that a couple of the kids are wading into the water, into the ocean. And he sees that the tide is looking like it's pulling them out. And the rabbi, without a second thought, jumped in after the kids. And in the instant, the riptide came in and pulled them away. The kids were saved. And the rabbi, a terrible incident, and it was in the news for days. Eventually, they found the body. And this is an incident that occurred just last year. Now, an incident like that actually shows how this kind of ethical issue comes up, and commonly comes up. But of course, you also see there how, it's very, very difficult to determine in advance the degree of risk. And of course, in a case like that, who wouldn't jump in? I mean, that would be your instinct, would be to jump in. You don't expect that a riptide is going to come in and that your life will be endangered. So we need to discuss degrees of risk. One of very, very important sources on this subject was written by the Rabbi David ibn Zimra. And we'll just take a moment on him. Rabbi David ibn Zimra, known as the Razvaz, was a leading Egyptian rabbi in the late 15th century. He was the chief rabbi of Egypt, the latter half of the 15th century. And Rabbi Ibn Zimra, a very prolific author, and his halachic writings are considered to be quite determinative. Now, he was asked a question. Well, it seems so. The question appears to have been phrased as a theoretical question, but nonetheless, it's interesting. It casts light on the type of issues that used to come up in those days. By the way, I think I was supposed to mention, I can mention now, if you like, you can write in a question on the chat, and I will do my best to read the chat and enter the questions at intervals. Also, we can try to take a couple of questions at the end if Laura can unmute us. But in the meantime, I wanted to talk about Rabbi Ibn Zimra. Here is the question that was asked him. Now, you took him 15th century in Egypt, and he was asked the following question: what happens if the ruler, the non-Jewish ruler, tells a Jewish person that you have to allow me to chop off one of your limbs, or I'm going to kill a different Jew. I'll kill this other person if you don't allow me to chop off one of your limbs. Now, again, the question appears to have been phrased in a theoretical manner, but it seems that this is, and by the way, this is a real thing. I mean, if you read the history of those times, chopping off limbs on the part of the government was a very, very real thing. It was done for various types of circumstances. Apparently, it was sometimes done on a whim. So this is the question that was asked. What do? Do you have to allow your limb to be chopped off, arm or whatever it is, in order to save the life of another individual who otherwise would be put to death? So Rabbi Ibn Zimra recorded that there was a contemporary of his who believed that you have to allow your limb to be chopped off. That you have to allow it because it's just one limb and you're saving the life of another person, and Jewish law would obligate you, according to this opinion, to obligate you to allow this limb of yours to be chopped off. And that Rabbi Ibn Zimra said that it's incorrect. He says, first of all, nobody's required to sacrifice a limb. There is no such a thing. We cannot possibly say that anyone is obligated to sacrifice their limb. Second of all, he said, there's always that possibility that the loss of blood will cause the loss of your own life. He says, we're assuming there's a doctor nearby and they'll try to stanch the wound, but you never really know there's a risk. And that risk is sufficient that there's no way to obligate you to have that, to have your limb chopped off. He says, but if you want to know whether it's meritorious or not, and this is the key part of the writing there, you want to know whether it's meritorious or not, said Rabbi Ibn Zimra, he says it depends on whether there's a so-called real substantive risk to your life or not, and I guess you have to speak to the doctor in advance. So he says, if there's a genuine, real risk to your life, then there's nothing meritorious about it. You should not be incurring a real risk to your own life in order to, even to save somebody else. But if it's just more of a lesser risk, and we'll discuss this in a moment, if it's just an ordinary lesser risk, something which the expectation would be that your life will not be forfeited, then it would be a meritorious thing. So we have these two levels there. One is the excessive amount of risk in which it's not even the right thing to do, and the other is the simple risk which we assume that nothing will happen to you, where we're going to say that it will be a meritorious thing. Now, the rabbis, the poskim, discuss this writing of Rabbi Ibn Zimra, and they write, we can use this and extrapolate from here to make a number of applications, to make a number of principles to apply from here. So basically, it's like this. I mean, we have the following. Many poskim say, many halachic authorities say, that generally speaking, you see somebody's life is in danger, and you run after them, and there's very, very often some level of danger. You can always, if you're a coward, you can find some level of danger. You'll have to run across the street, somebody's inside of a car, there was just a crash, you want to save them, well, it's a busy street. Maybe something will happen, maybe some car will go straight into me. You want to run into a river, it's somebody is drowning, you don't know how to swim. If I rush in, maybe I'll drown. You can always find some excuse. However, halachically, we do not accept that kind of excuse, and under those circumstances in which objectively we would expect that nothing will happen to you, we would actually obligate you to incur that risk. You're not allowed to hide behind a degree of cowardice. You're not allowed to hide behind the idea that, well, maybe something will happen to me and I'm not sure, and I can never. No one's ever 100% sure of what life will bring tomorrow. No one's 100% sure they'll still be around tomorrow. An ordinary, simple if the expectation is this is nothing, you can't just invent out of the clear blue sky that there's some risk to your life. And you have to go after the person and you have to save them. There's actually a litmus test that's provided by a well-known contemporary rabbi He said it regarding actually healthcare professionals, but it applies to other. Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein, the very famous rabbi in Bnei Brak, he said that many times people take some level of risk for their professions. You know, you have professions that are not so safe. People are lumberjacks. Some people are construction workers. There's all kinds of professions. People do endanger some kind of ordinary level of risk they incur in order to in the course of their profession. It says that a risk that you would take on in order to save your money or to make a livelihood, that risk is actually obligatory in the eyes of the halacha if somebody's life is at stake. You got to go out and save them. You're required, and it's actually a halachic obligation. However, if this risk is something that's beyond what I would ordinarily take on in the ordinary course of events, if this risk is something I would not normally risk, that my life, and I would not rush into a raging river in order because I'm losing some asset of mine, some money of mine, then the halacha will not obligate you to incur that risk yourself. And as Rabbi Levi said, so if, for example, and this is a specific example with regard to the COVID-19, for example, halacha would not obligate a person to incur any significant level of risk. Halacha would not, even if you're a healthcare worker and you're familiar and you're professional, we'll talk about later, halacha would not say that it's mandatory to incur any real significant level of risk. Perhaps there's circumstances in which the risk is minimal, in which case the halacha would obligate it. But under normal conditions, the halacha would not actually require a person to take on a significant level of risk. Now, a question was asked of Rabbi Zilberstein. Rabbi Zilberstein, by the way, we mentioned earlier, is actually a leading authority in the field of medical ethics, and he has written a multi-volume work on the subject. He was asked a question. It's hard to tell from the question whether it was asked in a real way. It's hard for me to see exactly how something would come up. But the question was asked about a doctor who knows that she's in the early stage of pregnancy. So she knows she's expecting, and there's a patient who has been stricken with rubella. Now, rubella is an infection that usually results in a mild illness, but it can result in birth defects if the infection occurs in pregnant women in early weeks of pregnancy, can damage the fetus's heart, etc., etc., etc. So now I would assume, by the way, that a doctor in the conditions like that would just find another doctor. It seems to me that the question would only come up if there's no one else. So you're the doctor, you're the only one, and you have this question. You want to know whether it's right or it's the wrong thing, or it's obligated or it's wrong to risk, in this case, primarily risking the fetus, for the sake of the patient whose apparently life was at risk. It was a very, very deathly ill patient with rubella. And the question is now, should you risk the fetus in order to save the life of the patient? Now, this is a much more difficult question ethically, by the way. You're not risking your own life. You're risking the life of the fetus. And who are you to risk someone else? On the other hand, the fetus is an unborn, and this leads to complex and difficult questions about the way we value, the value we place in the life of the fetus. We would give precedence to the life of the patient over the life of the fetus. Yes, no, and these are difficult questions. So this led to a very sharp give and take between Rabbi Zilberstein and another well-known contemporary rabbi. Rabbi Zilberstein responded that there's no question that you can't obligate someone. It's impossible to suggest, he said, that halacha would find some obligation for a doctor who is expecting and to risk the possibly birth defects in the fetus. It's impossible to suggest that the halacha would obligate such a person. Nonetheless, he says, if you want to take on that risk and you see that the patient's life is endangered and you can't stand by and you feel you want to take on that risk, he says actually he would think that's perfectly okay and it's meritorious. That's what he said, because a fetus, as much as we do value the life of the unborn in Jewish tradition, nonetheless, we're still entitled to say that we risk the life and the limbs of the fetus for the sake of the life of the patient, who's a living, breathing patient and whose life is at risk. That's what he said. This halachic ruling of Rabbi Zilberstein resulted in a very, very sharp response from another leading scholar, Rabbi Avigdor Nebenzal, who is still alive today. He was the chief rabbi of the old city of Jerusalem for many, many years. Today he's retired as chief rabbi. still a very important head of the yeshiva in Israel, Rabbi Nebenzal. And Rabbi Nebenzal, very, very erudite scholar, very, very prominent scholar. And he responded very sharply, and he said that he doesn't accept that at all. He said, there's no way are we going to say that it's meritorious to risk life and limb of the fetus. Why is that meritorious, he says? He says he would question whether it's even the right thing to do at all. Maybe it's not, it might not even be Jewishly permitted, he says. You're risking a birth defect in the fetus in order to save, it's true you're saving someone's life, but who allows you to take on that risk? And he says, even if it is acceptable halachically, even if it's okay, there's no reason at all to think that it's meritorious. So this is the statement of Rabbi Silverstein, of Rabbi Nebenzal. In this particular case, you could see how there was a give and take there, and this is a particular case where you're not risking your own life. You're actually risking somebody else's. You're risking the life of the fetus, and it's a much more complex question about the value of the life of the unborn, which is a very complex topic, Jewishly speaking. We've spoken a bit this other times in the context of abortions, what Judaism has to say about abortions, yes, no, different opinions. So the life of the unborn is a complicated subject, and in this case, you're risking defects, and you're risking the life of the unborn. So that's a more complex topic. But generally speaking, we would say that it is halachically acceptable to incur some degree of risk. And in fact, it's meritorious, although we would not say that it is obligatory. Now, this brings us, and this was discussed extensively in the 60s and 70s when organ donations first came up. And it was considered to be, we have a very serious question, by the way. Let's say you know that you're a kidney donor, or you're a possible kidney donor, you can be tested, and you might be a potential kidney donor for someone who needs a kidney and their life is endangered. They may die if they don't get a kidney transplant. So, we have three possibilities. One is maybe it's wrong to be a kidney donor. Today, it's hard to make that argument because the risk is relatively negligible. But decades ago, this argument was made very seriously when kidney donations were first a real thing in the 60s. There were rabbis who felt that it was wrong. They felt that you have no right to take that risk. They felt it was a measurable amount of risk, a real measurable risk to your own life, the life of the donor. And in the 60s, there were rabbis who argued that one should not donate a kidney. That was at that time. Today, you really don't have that particular argument because kidney donation is considered very safe. But nonetheless, in the history of the halachic discussion, we do have, back from the days of the 60s, and you can read these writings today, there were prominent scholars who questioned whether it was okay at all to donate a kidney. Maybe you have no right to take on that risk to your life. Now, the second possibility is to go to the other extreme and say maybe it's absolutely obligatory to donate a kidney. Now, I personally have felt for some time that you could make that argument. It's a possible cogent argument. You could say that if it really is true that the risk to the donor is negligible, then we could argue that perhaps it's actually obligatory. It's halachically obligatory, because even though there's some risk, there's always some risk when you donate an organ. Of course, there's something, but you could say that the poskim always tell us that a negligible risk you're supposed to ignore. You have no right to be a coward. You have no right to constantly be fearful of your own shadow and to refuse to donate. So you could make that argument that it's halachically obligatory to donate a kidney. Or you could make the middle argument that it's certainly not halachically obligatory, but it is meritorious, and it's a very big mitzvah. It's one of the greatest mitzvahs. You're saving someone's life, no question about that. So that's an in-between position, and as we'll see, that's the position of most posting today, actually. This is the normative position today, is that it is not obligatory to donate a kidney. You're allowed to be nervous about the risk and refuse, but it is a meritorious thing. I personally think it's a little unclear. So I want to go back a little bit. If you go back to the 60s, when the poskim began to discuss this topic, at that time, there were many who felt, and by the way, I mentioned before Dr. Starzl, who was here in Pittsburgh for many, many years, and really pioneered in many ways the field of transplant. So Dr. Starzl did many, many kidney transplants, and he began doing them in the 60s, early 60s when he started doing it. And he did many successful kidney transplants during the 60s and pioneered the techniques. So at that time, there were rabbis who felt that you got to really worry about the risk to the life of the donor, and maybe the donor should not do it. And this argument was made by Rabbi Waldenberg, a prominent posek, the author of the Tzitz Eliezer, and a number of other rabbis at that time felt that it's actually wrong to donate a kidney. There were a couple of very, very prominent rabbinic authorities at that time who took the opposite position. And one of them was Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was really perhaps the most prominent rabbinic authority in America, Orthodox rabbinic authority in America in the latter part of the 20th century. The question was put to him. Many of the most difficult questions came to his desk. And he was asked this question about donating a kidney. Is it right? Is it wrong? Is it indifferent? Is it in between? And he researched the topic. He looked into it. He asked around among medical experts, what's the level of risk? And he was told that there's some risk. That's what he was told at the time. Anyway, there's some risk, but it's not a really great amount of risk. It's substantive, but not tremendous. So after time, Rabbi Feinstein delved into the sources, and he arrived at the conclusion that it's meritorious and a very great mitzvah to donate a kidney, even though it cannot be said to be halachically obligatory. We cannot oblige you, we can not obligate you, but it is meritorious. Now, this is actually the normative view today in today's times, that it's the right thing to donate a kidney. It's a tremendous, one of the greatest mitzvahs, but it's impossible to obligate anyone. If they refuse, if they say, I'm nervous about with some risk, something will happen to me, we allow them, Jewishly speaking, to refuse. This was the ruling of Rabbi Levi Yosef as well, one of the great Sephardic authorities in the late 20th century. He also said it was meritorious, but not an obligation. Again, I personally, I've wondered about this for some time. We're now in the year, 2020, and the kidney donations are considered to be very safe, although to be sure, nothing will ever be 100% safe. You never reach 100%. There's always some possibility. But nonetheless, it's considered very safe. So what my question is, and I'm just putting it out there, at what point are we going to reach the point when we'll say that it's now so safe that you're obligated? It's no different from when you're running across a busy street, or, both ways, and you run, you save somebody's life. They were in a crash at the other side of the street. We don't say you're allowed to be a coward and say, well, I hate crossing busy streets. I'm always nervous. You look both ways, and you have to run across. So will we reach the point at which kidney donations the ruling will be changed? Will we say at some point that it's actually halachically obligatory? And I'm not clear about this point. I've noticed that that has not yet happened. We have not yet reached that change, but I personally find this to be an interesting thing and perhaps rather surprising. I don't know whether at some point we're going to be changing our ruling on the kidneys and make it obligatory. Now, this leads us to a couple of other questions. There is a question about a physician, whether we would say, now, do we say that physicians are expected, quote unquote, to risk their lives even where ordinary people would not, because the physician is the person with the expertise, the physician is the person with the professional knowledge and the expert knowledge, and they're there, and that's their role. So maybe would we say we would expect a physician to risk their life and to incur a greater level of risk than we expect ordinary people to do? Now, I actually, in looking into this, I found one writer that claimed that according to the halacha, there's an actual halachic obligation for a physician to incur a significant level of risk, which would not require ordinary people to incur. My research has not substantiated that. I cannot find that anywhere. It does not look to me like this is a correct reading of the sources. But what you do have is various rabbis who have written that a physician who wants to step up and sees it as their moral obligation is entitled to incur a significant level of risk. Now, this leads us, and I want to take a moment on this. Heaven forbid, you see somebody in the burning building and you want to rush in. So the fire department is there and they tell you, stop, you can't rush. You're risking your own life, and they want to stop you from rushing in. So what's the right thing? What's the right thing? What's the wrong thing? Is it wrong? Is it right? What's the story with the burning building? So again, like we said before, it's usually under circumstances like that, very hard to be objective and calm. But the answer is, based on the Jewish tradition, the correct answer that is as follows. If the risk is negligible, there's a little fire there, but you're an expert and you know about burning buildings that you can get in, it's a very small amount of risk for you, then you're actually obligated to run into the building. If you know what you're doing and it's not a substantive risk, then you got to run it. You can't say, well, there's a fire there and there's always some risk. You're not allowed to do that. That's if you know exactly what you're doing. That doesn't generally happen. But if that's the case and you know good and well that you're able to get around the fire and you can rescue the person, then you're obligated. If, on the other hand, the flames are such that it's likely that you won't survive if you go in, let's say a more than 50% likelihood that you won't survive, then it seems that the consensus of the poskim is that you're not allowed to run into the building. In other words, once we reach the point that the majority likelihood is that you won't survive if you incur this risk, then you're actually not allowed to take on that level of risk. It's not allowed. It's as if we look upon it as if it would be almost a certainty, so to speak, that you will die die and won't survive, and you're not allowed to give up your own life to the life of another, which is, by the way, the last topic I wanted to get to. We'll talk about it. The question of giving up one's own life for somebody else's. Generally speaking, this is not considered allowed. We'll talk about it. And therefore, you're actually not allowed, according to most poskim, most authorities, you can't run into the burning building if the majority likelihood that you won't survive. What happens if likely you will survive, but nonetheless, there's a pretty substantial risk? But you probably will survive. You know what you're doing. You've been in burning buildings before. So what's the story there? So the answer to that is that you're not obligated to run in, but if it's likely you'll survive, then it's a good thing to do and it's meritorious. And by the way, that's what firefighters often do. You know, this is what the firefighters often do. They go into the burning buildings and they risk their lives. So no one's going to say that they're obligated to do that. They're not obligated to risk their lives, but nonetheless, it's ethically the right thing. It's good. It's a good thing to do. It's what the firefighters actually do. They go into the burning buildings and they do incur some sort of risk. And obviously some measured amount of risk. I'm sure they have their own protocols, how much the risk they're willing to take. But whatever it is, they incur a substantive risk. And this is considered to be a meritorious thing to do. Maybe you stick to the people in that case, the people who know what they're doing. Leave it to the firefighters who know what they're doing. You don't do it. You don't know what you're doing. But as a concept, the concept is that it's meritorious to incur a substantive amount of risk with a likelihood is that you'll survive. By the case of the doctor, the poskim say that it's acceptable for a doctor to incur somewhat of an extra amount of risk, although there again, it seems that most hold that a doctor should not be taking a risk that will likely lead to their death. That's considered ethically wrong, but a risk that's so-called 50-50 is acceptable for a doctor. Many different arguments have been adduced for this idea. Some say that the concept there is that without physicians, without doctors, our society would, you could imagine today, if there would be no doctors, all the doctors would suddenly bow out, you know, that they go on vacation. Because they don't want to take any risks. So heaven forbid our society could have been consumed over the last couple of months. There would be no physicians. Physicians are at the foundations of our society. The idea of medical care, of people getting out there and taking care of us, are at the foundation of our society. And therefore, the Jewish tradition and the Halacha accept the notion that the physician will be prepared to take on a risk. Not that they're obligated, but we accept the concept that the physician will take on a risk. We don't frown upon it, and we don't look upon it as something which is wrong. So just to wrap up this part of the discussion, just as follows. If the risk is somewhat negligible, it's something which you would take on in the ordinary course of events for your livelihood. If that's what it is, then you are obligated to save the fellow. You got to jump into the river. You got to run across the street, run across the highway, look both ways first, save the guy who was in the crash. Whatever it is, if it's a substantively negligible risk, it's not a real risk that people are really, really worried about in the ordinary course of events. If the risk is, on the other hand, the other extreme, something which will likely lead to one's death, you're actually not allowed to take on that risk. It's considered to be forbidden, and this applies to burning buildings. It applies to people who are being swept away by the current. It's a horrible situation to be in, and we should never be in this situation. But if a person is in that situation, they have to try to be as objective as they can, and they will be obligated in that case to refrain from risking themselves. If it's a substantive risk, but more likely than not that you will not end up dying, you're more than likely than not your life will not be forfeit, then it's a meritorious thing, and that's how we classify kidney donations today. That the post can classify it. That's why they don't consider them obligatory, but they do consider them a very, very big mitzvah and a meritorious thing. The same as with physicians that risk their lives. These are people who are taking a risk. This is substantive, and we cannot obligate it. Nonetheless, it's something with a risk which is meritorious and appropriate under the right circumstances to take on that risk. And that leads me to my last topic, which we have 7 minutes or 11, depending on how far we go, how late we go. I wanted to talk about the idea of giving up one's life for somebody else. And this is the tale of two cities dilemma. I don't know if you know the tale of two cities, or maybe you read it in high school and have forgotten it since then. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the tale of two cities, written by a fellow named Dickens, who you probably heard of. It's one of his most famous books. And Dickens wrote this story. And just very quickly, what's relevant to us is that this character in the story by the name of Sidney Carton, who's a lowlife and a ne'er-do-well, and he's a drunk, and he never does anything for anybody. And then one fine day, he turns over a new leaf, and in the end of the story, he gives up his life to save somebody else by the name of Charles Darnay, who looks like him, and this fellow Charles Darnay is about to be executed. So Sidney Carton steps in his place and gives up his life and gets executed instead of this fellow Darnay. And the very, very famous line near the end of the book, it says, this is what Carton, Dickens puts this into his mouth: "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done." Okay, so that's what he says. A far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. So according to the opinion of Dickens, if you think of him as an ethicist, it is a good thing, especially if you're a lowlife and not worth much yourself. So it's a good thing to give up your life for somebody else. This is what Charles Dickens wrote, and that's actually the crux of this novel, The Tale of Two Cities. So do we agree or do we disagree? And this is a very serious question. Should you give up your life? Now, there's different circumstances, and the halachic authorities discuss this. I mean, first of all, maybe there was actually, by the way, I probably discussed this in my Holocaust series this Sunday night. If you want to tune in on our Holocaust series, there was an incident in the Nazi Germany, in Poland actually. There was the Nazis were hunting after the Grand Rabbi of Belz, the Belzer Rebbe, and they were hot on his trail. They had found the city he was located. They wanted to kill him. And his life was very, very much in danger. And the Hasidim, the Belzer Hasidim, the disciples of the Rebbe, were very, very nervous. And one of the elderly Hasids, one of the elderly Hasidim, said, "I'm going to do something about this." And he was a fellow with a long gray beard, ordinary guy, not a particular rabbi, but a long gray beard. He stepped forward, presented himself to the Nazis, and said, "I am the Grand Rabbi, take me away." And he looked good, he looked the act. He had this gray, whitish beard, long beard. He looked elderly and looked like a rabbi. And the Nazis arrested him, and they ended up putting him to death. And the Belzer Rebbe ended up escaping to Israel and reestablished the Belzer dynasty, which is today one of the greatest and largest Hasidic groups. So this is a story. It's a well-known story. Is that good or bad? What's the story with that? I wanted to discuss that briefly. There is a dispute about this, the Tale of Two Cities dilemma. That, by the way, over there, it wasn't a lowlife, bad person giving up his life for the good person. Now we have the ordinary fellow giving up his life for the scholarly, the saintly individual, someone who's a leader of thousands. So is that right? How about you want to give up your life, and sometimes it's going to happen. The person wants to give up their life for the child. The child's life is in danger. I'm going to do it, even if it means giving up my life. I lived my life already. I'm already most of the way through life, right? My child hasn't even lived life yet. I want to give up my life for my child. I'll go into the burning building. I'll throw the kid out the window, etc., even if it means giving up my own life. Is this something which Judaism accepts? And this is actually a big, big controversy. And I'll go through the views just briefly, but I want to tell you one source, a major source, a medieval work called Sefer Hasidim, the Book of the Pious. By the way, the Sefer Hasidim was written in the approximately 1300, so it predates the contemporary Hasidim by about 500 years, by more than that. So it's a work, but it's called the Book of the Pious. It's a Kabbalistic-oriented work. It was authored apparently by a group of scholars, the German Pietist school around the year 1300. The Sefer Hasidim writes that if you have the government authorities show up one day and they're about to put someone to death, they're about to put a great scholar to death, and the other guy is an ordinary fellow in the other end of the room, so he's allowed, it's actually a mitzvah. This is what it says in the Book of the Pious. It's a mitzvah, this ordinary fellow to step forward and say, Hadoguni b'makomo, kill me in his stead. Kill me in his stead. So that is meritorious, and it is a mitzvah, and this is what it says in the Book of the Pious. Now, the Book of the Pious, Sefer Hasidim, is not a halachic work. It's not a halacha. We don't determine halacha based on it. It's a book of pietist teachings, which have been handed down and cherished by Jews over the generations, but it's not a halachic work. But he claims to have an ancient tradition, which we do not have in our versions of the Talmud. He claims that this happened in the Talmudic times, that there was a man by the name of Rabbi Reuven ben Isterubli, who actually, according to his tradition, gave up his life so that the life of the great leader Rabbi Akiva should be saved. Now, this is what he says. Apparently, Rabbi Akiva's life was endangered. They were going to kill him. And Rabbi Reuven steps forward. He says, kill me. And they killed him instead of Rabbi Akiva. And he concludes that Rabbi Akiva was a person who the entire public needed him. They needed his leadership. They needed his teachings. They needed his ethical guidance. So therefore, Rabbi Reuven had himself step forward and volunteer to be killed in Rabbi Akiva's stead. This is what it says in the Sefer Hasidim. Now, we have on this a very big dispute. And there are halachic authorities quoted in the Sefer Tzitz Eliezer, an important 20th century work, and they were of the opinion that we can actually follow this in practice. So one work called the Yad Eliyahu, written by Rabbi Elia Klatskin, as I recall, a very important late 19th century rabbi, chief rabbi of Lublin, Poland, and he said that absolutely that's the halacha. You can give up your life. You have to make some sort of determination. The other fellow is more saintly than you, is a better person than you. Some say maybe even if they aren't a better quote unquote person than you, it's hard to make the determination. But maybe they're a giving person, they're kind, they're erudite, they're scholarly. So I'm going to give up my life for that person. Or what if I give my life up for somebody much younger than me who hasn't lived life yet? Some say maybe that's acceptable, all based upon this teaching of the Sefer Hasidim. On the other hand, we have contemporary rabbis, decisors who have written very sharply against this. And the author of the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Waldenberg, and particularly Moshe Feinstein, in a very sharply written essay in his Shuvos and his halachic writings, they both say that they believe that this is wrong, and no one has the right to, in Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's idea, to play God and decide that my life is worth less than someone else's. But Feinstein writes that maybe you think it's good, maybe it's meritorious. I'm just an ordinary person. That other person is saintly and they're scholarly and they do mitzvos all the time and they're giving and they're who knows what. Rabbi Feinstein says you do not have the right to make that decision about yourself. Even if you believe it to be objectively true, that is playing God. That's the wrong thing. You cannot sacrifice your life for someone else. That was likewise the conclusion of Rabbi Waldenberg, and this appears to me the more predominant view among the later contemporary rabbinic authorities. No one is allowed to give up their life for somebody else, and therefore, as we said, this is the bottom line. Let's conclude with this, because it looks like either we have no questions, or I don't know how to read the chat. Or I don't want to read the chat. I see Laura Turner wrote, we're going to have to wrap up in about 2 minutes. Okay, I can read the chat. So I'll wrap up. Here's my wrap up. The bottom line is this. As far as giving up one's life for someone else, you're giving up your life for them. The tale of two cities dilemma, we do not agree with Charles Dickens. We have an ethical dispute with Mr. Dickens. He says it was a great thing that Mr. Carton gave up his life. We think it's not. Even if Mr. Carton recognized himself to be a drunk and a lowlife, nonetheless, it's not your job to play God. You stay alive. Don't give up your life, even for somebody who's very good. And for the question of incurring risk, on the other hand, we have the following. If the risk is relatively negligible, it's a risk that you take in the ordinary course of living your life, then you're obligated to take on that risk to save somebody else. You can't say, I'm nervous, I'm nervous, I'm afraid. You have no right to say that. You have to take on that risk. If it's a very grave risk, a risk that likely you won't survive it, we do not even allow you to take on that risk at all. If it is a substantive risk, but more likely than not you will survive, then it seems that most authorities are of the opinion we do not obligate you to take on that risk, but it is meritorious and it's good. And we hold today that, for example, many things that the doctors have been doing, that household volunteers have been doing in the context of this COVID pandemic have fallen under that parameters. It's a very wonderful, meritorious thing, even if it isn't obligatory. Likewise, with live organ donations and the like, we consider this to be the same category. It's a good thing, it's a proper thing. But we do not consider it obligatory. Now, if I don't know, if anybody has questions, I can take the questions for 2 minutes. It's only 10:52. If nobody has questions, then we're also good, and we can just go to sleep. I don't know. Should I try to unmute, or maybe nobody has questions? Okay. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate you enjoyed my talk.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Lander.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Very thoughtful, timely session. If anyone else would like to attend a session for the third grouping, I've listed them in the chat. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.